بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله ثم أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He has spoken about the concept of azwaj, what we usually understand to refer to partners, many times in the Quran. Azwaj being the plural of the word zawj. And zawj we usually understand to mean a partner or a spouse, or simply two things that are paired up together. And if we look to the Quran, we find that the term azwaj and zawj is not specific to marriage alone. Rather, it's a universal phenomenon that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about in the Quran itself. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, Subhana alladhi khalaqa al-azwaja kullaha. Glory be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who created all types of azwaj, all forms of pairs. Mimma tunbitul ard, those pairs that come from the earth, and we'll speak about what that means. Wa min anfusihim, and also from amongst themselves, meaning amongst human beings He has created them in pairs. Wa mimma la ya'lamun, and He has also created other things in pairs from matters where human beings are completely unaware of. So in this ayah, Allah speaks about three types of pairs. Pairs in plants, and we find that today those who study biology and botanics and etc. will realize many plants come in pairs. Human beings, of course, in pairs, male and female. And from those things which we are unaware of as well. So there are things we have discovered later on in time, protons and neutrons and many things, other things as well that come in pairs as well. Likewise, in other places in the Quran, Allah speaks about it again. وَمِن كُلِّ شَيْءٍ خَلَقَنَا زَوْجَيْنِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَذَكَّرُونَ. And we have created everything in pairs, that perhaps they may remember and reflect. We've created everything in pairs that perhaps they may remember and reflect. And an ayah which I'm sure many of you have heard and probably seen on many wedding invitation cards, the famous ayah from Surah Al-Rum. وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا. And from the ayat of Allah, from the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is that He created from amongst you your partners. لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا, so that you find that repose and tranquility and sakina and peace with your spouse. وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً, and He placed between you this love and mercy. إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ, indeed in that there are signs for people who reflect. لِقَوْمِ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. An ayah which I'm sure many of you have heard, but many of us probably fail to realize why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions it's from His ayat, from the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now we've mentioned already, and we mentioned some of the other verses where Allah clearly states that He created everything in pairs. Everything is in pairs. And these pairs are dependent upon one another. So for example, another example of pairs is night and day, which Allah speaks about in many places in the Quran. The alternation between night and day. We have land and sea, light and darkness, guidance and misguidance. Everything you find in creation, Allah has created in pairs. Now reflect upon the relationship between these pairs. If just one of those out of the pairs, just one existed, the first element or one element of the pair existed by itself, what would happen? So take for example, with daylight, Allah has created night and day. Imagine we lived in a universe where we only experience darkness. Would life continue to exist? Would life continue to exist? No. If Allah created the creation such that there was only daylight, again, would life continue to exist? No. Okay? And if you reflect upon the other type of pairs we find in creation, then the same can be said. These pairs are dependent upon one another. Every pair is dependent upon one. So amongst human beings, Allah has created us in zawjain or azwaj. He's created us in pairs. So man cannot live without women, and women cannot live without men, in order for the continuance of the human race. That dependency is from the ayat of Allah. That dependency upon one another is from the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to point to the fact that Allah created everything in pairs, whereas He Himself is Al-Wahid Al-Ahad, the one, La Sharika Lahu, who has no partner, who has no partner. And He is As-Samad, and As-Samad means the one who sustains Himself. He is not dependent upon anybody else or anything else to exist. So we need to realize, when Allah says these are ayat, these are signs, they point to the oneness of Allah, and they point to the need of creation. That creation, they are in need of this other, of their other partner. Now, if we look to this particular pair that Allah has created mankind upon, the pair between man and male and female, we find that out of all types of relationship that we have in life, we find that Islam, and not just Islam, but even the rest of the world really, we find that they pay great attention to this relationship between men and women. And particularly in Islam, we find great attention has been paid to it. Just to give an example of how great it is. One day, someone came running to Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu. And he said, a great calamity has befallen the Muslim community. And so the first thing that came to the thought of Umar ibn Khattab was that the tribe of Ghassan, which is a tribe to the north of the peninsula, Arabian Peninsula, he thought they've come to invade us. And the man said, no, there's something greater than that. And Umar ibn Khattab was thinking, what could be greater than Ghassan coming to invade us? So they went to the masjid to find out what was happening. As soon as Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, he entered the masjid, he found all of the Sahaba, they were crying. So which further added to the, to the worry and concern of Umar ibn Khattab. And then he asked the people, what has happened? What has happened? Does anyone know what the reply was? The reply was that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam divorced his wives. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam divorced his wives. This was a huge calamity for the Muslim Ummah. Why? Because they saw the importance of this relationship between the Prophet ﷺ and his wives. It wasn't any ordinary relationship. You wouldn't have found that response if, for example, a business agreement, for example, broke down between two colleagues. Or, for example, two people that were once friends are no longer friends anymore. But when it came to separation between a man and a wife, it was seen as a huge calamity. Now obviously the calamity was especially great because it was between the Prophet ﷺ and his wives. Okay? But again, just to further maybe reiterate and to show you the importance and how Islam views it as such a great matter. In a hadith is reported that shaitan, this is a well-known hadith, that shaitan, Iblis himself, he placed his arsh, he placed his throne on the water. ثم يبعث سرايا, and then he sent out delegations of other shayateen, of other devils. And so it was said that فَأَدْنَاهُمْ مِنْهُ مَنْزِلَةً أَعْظَمُهُمْ فِتْنَةً. Out of all of the shayateen that he sent out, those who would be closest to him in the end would be those who created the most mischief upon the earth. Those who created the most mischief upon the earth. They would be closest to shaitan himself. So after a while, after sending out the delegations of these shayateen, the devils, they came back to Iblis himself. And they would mention, فعلت كذا وكذا, يعني I did such and such. Maybe I made someone commit murder, I made someone steal, I made someone lie, I made someone do X, Y, Z. And he will say, ما صنعت شيئا. He will say to them, that's nothing, you haven't done anything. And then one devil will come. One devil will come and he will say, I went to a couple, husband and wife, and I didn't leave them until they separated from one another. I didn't leave them until they separated one another, meaning he made them divorced from one another. And then shaitan, he will take hold of this devil and he will say, Na'am anta, yes you are the one who will be brought closest to me. Look how the shaitan, subhanallah, how he views the significance of this relationship between man and wife. And as we know, whenever the shaitan tries very hard to achieve something, we know how virtuous it is, isn't it? So if he's trying to achieve separation, then we know the virtue of staying together in marriage. Okay? And so many, we can speak day and night really about how Islam views marriage, and how really amongst human beings it is the most important relationship upon this earth. Obviously the most absolute important relationship is the relationship between man and his creator, without a shadow of a doubt. That's the most important relationship. But the most important relationship amongst human beings is that between men and women. Okay, between men and women. So we have to really understand this point, okay, and realize that it is the bedrock and the foundation of a healthy society. If we can correct and reform and the relationship between men and women in society, it will really give the foundation of a healthy, not just of a healthy family structure, but a healthy community and a healthy society as a whole. Okay, and this is why we find so much ahadith encouraging people to get married in a halal way and to fulfill their needs in a halal way. Now, if we say that this relationship is the most important relationship amongst human beings, how should we form this relationship? What should this relationship be based upon? Now, the first point we need to remember is that the one who created us knows best how we should interact with one another. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, أَلَا يَعْلَمُ مَنْ خَلَقَ وَهُوَ اللَّطِيفُ الْخَبِيرُ. Does not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala know who he created? Meaning, doesn't he know best who he created? And he is the Al-Latif, the all-subtle, and Al-Khabir, yani the all-acquainted. Yani he knows the intricate details of man and women. He knows the differences between the two, whether it's physically or psychologically or physiologically or socially or etc. He knows and recognizes the differences. We live in a time though where we want to exclude the Creator from the way we interact with one another in society. Yeah, to God is to God, and to Caesar is, we give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. So this understanding of life and this understanding of secularism, where we exclude the Creator from how we interact with one another in society, is a dominant feature, we can say, in the secular Western civilization. But we must reiterate and we must remind ourselves that the best person to judge how we should interact with one another, this very important relationship, is the one who created us. Now, if you look to the way, for example, in this society, how gender relations is viewed, and from a Muslim perspective, we see a crisis. We see a crisis. Why? Because number one, we see that many people who try to ascertain and understand the exact relationship between men and women, how it should be, we see that they've got it all wrong. So from amongst people we find, amongst mankind in society, we find those who view, for example, men to be, okay, and I'm going to say in this specific way, just to get you thinking, we have those who think that men are exactly like women. That men have exactly the same rights as women. I've said it in a strange way, isn't it? What way would you think what's the normal way of how people would have maybe worded that or phrased that? Huh? Not just equal rights. Women, isn't it? Yeah? So you have those who think women should have the equal rights of men. Okay? But you don't usually hear it the other way around, do you? Okay, but in essence it's the same thing. That's why really, we can say this feminist movement, it's really a movement for women to be like men, essentially. Okay? And to have exactly the same rights and to be like men. Now, we have to acknowledge, and one of the reasons why we find there's a problem in this particular understanding is that people fail to recognize the differences between the two genders, and also because there's a misconception, and that misconception is that equality is synonymous to justice. Equality is exactly the same as justice, meaning when there is no equality, that means there is no what? Justice. Okay? Now from an Islamic perspective we say no. This is not necessarily true. Yes, at times equality will give you justice. And sometimes inequality will lead to oppression and it will lead to the opposite of justice, injustice. But just take a look in society, for example today. We find there are many areas where there is no equality. But at the same time, we see that that inequality is actually justice. For example, many of us use public transport. Okay, all of you have to pay for your public transport, right? Okay, but if you are young, a child, or you're a pensioner, do you have to pay for your transport? No. Is that equality? Is it equality? It's not equality. That inequality, does it serve the purpose of justice or injustice? Justice, isn't it? Why? Because we realize, well, young people, they can't really afford to, they don't have money, number one. And elderly people, they're not working, they don't really have a sustainable income like other people do. So we have to appreciate the differences in order to establish justice. Any other aspect in society. For example, go to sports. We find that sports are generally segregated between men and women. Men play amongst themselves, women play amongst themselves. Now imagine, for example, a famous footballer decided to go, a male footballer decided to apply for a women's football team. Would he be accepted? No, of course not. It would never be accepted. Vice versa, if a woman applied for a male football team, it wouldn't be accepted. That is inequality, but it's justice. Why? Because we realize the difference between men and women. Men are physically stronger. They can overpower women very easily, physically. So how far do we recognize and acknowledge these differences? Who is the best person to judge the extent of these differences? Me or you, or the one who created us? Without a shadow of a doubt, the one who created us. So therefore, this relationship, and we can acknowledge, even in this society, they acknowledge the psychological differences, the physiological differences, the emotional differences between men and women. So let the one who created us decide the best way that we are meant to interact with one another. And we say very confidently as Muslims that the best manner or the complete way and the best manner of interaction between the opposite gender is based upon marriage and family ties. Okay, now that doesn't mean that if there is no marriage and no family ties between you and the opposite gender, there can be no form of relationship whatsoever. I'm not saying that. I'm saying in the complete and overall sense that in order for there to be the complete interaction between men and women, then that really should be based upon a sound, healthy relationship based upon the principles of marriage within Islam. And this is why we find that Islam encourages marriage greatly. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, Ya ma'ashara al-shabab, O assembly of youth, whoever is able to marry, then let him marry. Then he should get married. Why? Because it helps to lower his gaze and to protect his chastity. But if he's not capable of doing that, then he should fast, because that will diminish and reduce his desires. Likewise, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, إِذَا تَزَوَّجَ الْعَبْدُ فَقَدْ اسْتَكْمَلَ نِصْفَ دِينِهِ. That when a slave of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gets married, he completes half of his religion. He completes half of his religion. فَلْيَتَّقِ اللَّهِ فِي مَا بَقِي. And then let him fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with regards to the other part of his deen. Subhanallah, marriage is half of the deen. Marriage is half of the religion. And why is it in particular half of the religion? Because many scholars, they commented upon this hadith and they said that if we look to the major sources of sin, then there are two major sources of sin. One is that which is concerning a person's sexuality, and the other is concerning his stomach. Okay, so we have obviously the sins associated with sexuality, that's easily understood. But then you have those other sins associated with the stomach. And what could that refer to? Obviously haram, eating haram food. But it's more than that, because how do you eat food? How do you buy food? Based upon having money. Where do you earn that money from? What circumstances? Do you cheat people? Do you oppress people? Do you have a haram income, etc.? So we find that society revolves around, in many cases, the relationships that we have between people based upon these two, you can say, major sources of sin. But at the same time, they can be sources of great reward at the same time. That's why I say, why do I stress upon this fact? Because in Islam, we don't view sexuality in a negative way. We don't view it, for example, as being a sin to have desires. We don't view it like that at all whatsoever. Rather, in Islam, we view it as something healthy. We view it as something healthy, something which is beneficial to man, to society. It helps a person to free himself to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a clearer way, with a clearer conscience. And that's why some of the Sahaba at the time, earlier on when Islam was first being, the rulings of Islam was being given to the Sahaba, some of the Sahaba, because they found, they wanted to engage in many acts of worship, they asked the Prophet ﷺ permission to essentially, castrate themselves. Okay, so they would have no physical, no sexual desires. But the Prophet said, no, this is not correct. This is not correct. In fact, the Prophet encouraged the opposite, for people to get married. And we don't view marriage just as a means to have children, for example. In some maybe faiths and traditions, that's the purpose of, fulfilling your sexual desires. It's just to bear children, have children. In Islam, we don't view it like that. We don't view it like that. We view it as a sacred act between man and woman. And something that Islam enshrines, and it wants to protect from any form of corruption, and it encourages it, in fact, as we see in these ahadith. The Prophet's telling people to get married, encouraging people to get married, to the extent he said that marriage is from my way, and whoever doesn't get married, whoever doesn't desire my way, فَلَيْسَ مِنِّي, then he is not from my way, he is not following my path. It's from my way for people to get married. So subhanAllah, it's a great act of ibadah within our religion. A great act of ibadah within our religion. But we can see though that what happens when this relationship between men and women is not governed by the principles of the institution of marriage, what happens as a result of that? We don't need to look further than this society to see the ill effects of that. The promiscuity, children born outside of wedlock, zina, fornication, adultery, breakdown of family structures, people moving on, how many single mothers we have, because people don't feel that they're bound to a relationship. So as a result, after a few years of your relationship with your partner, if it's not within the boundaries of marriage, then people get bored and they move on. And so many illnesses, so many vices as a result of people not adhering to this institution of marriage. And so how you find today many people, for example, they are scared to get into a relationship, into a marriage. The amount of people getting married today is reducing, rapidly. Why? Because people they fear commitment. And some people, they think beyond that. They don't want to get married because they don't want the pain of divorce. Okay, because and many people that have had experience in marriages and they've already divorced. For them, for many people that have experienced divorce in this country, in this society, and the way it's done, they don't want to get married again because they know what a great pain it is to get divorced. Whereas in Islam, divorce is treated very differently. From many aspects, it's actually very easy to do. Okay, and that's why really, subhanallah, no matter how much people criticize in our Sharia, wallahi, if a person wants to study the Sharia with an open heart and study the rulings pertaining to marriage and divorce and generally relationships between human beings as a whole, they will see a miracle within the Sharia. They will see a miracle within the Sharia for the solution it provides and the harmony that it creates. So we mentioned that maybe some of the consequences of people not adhering to this institution of marriage. Inshallah, we're going to relate that to life in university, and especially that I'm addressing students. We need to really focus on this area a bit more. But before we do that, let us just understand maybe some of the major functions or purposes behind marriage within Al-Islam. Firstly, especially for youth, people of your age, usually marriage, it fulfills one major purpose, you can say. Okay? At this age, as you know, you all have certain needs, you have desires, etc. And you feel as though you need to get married in order to fulfill these needs and desires in a halal way. Which is correct. And that's one of the purposes of marriage. One of the purposes of marriage within Islam. Without a shadow of a doubt. To protect your chastity, to protect yourself from falling into sin, and protect yourself from falling into zina, fornication. But there are other lofty ambitions as well, other lofty goals, such as what? Not just protecting yourself from, from vice, and promiscuity and zina, but also protecting your partner from that as well. So you see it more than an individualistic way. You see it as a way that you can help someone else in protecting their deen. You're helping someone else protect their deen. Also, as we know, one of the major outcomes of marriage is children. One of the major outcomes of marriage is children. And unfortunately, for many people, children is just a necessary outcome of marriage. It's a matter of necessity. And you get married, you have children. That's what it means to have a family. But they don't think beyond that. Now in Islam, we attach great importance to children for a particular purpose. As Rasulullah ﷺ said, تَزَوَّجُوا الْوَدُودَ الْوَلُودَ, that marry, the loving people, loving women, love those who bear children, who can bear many children. And the way you ascertain that is by looking to their family members to see if they have, if their sisters, for example, bear many children. Why? Because I will be proud of you on the Day of Judgment. I will be proud of you on the Day of Judgment. Why will He be proud of us? Just because we have many people? No. Not just simply because there are many Muslims, but because there were many people that worshipped Allah and made tasbih of Allah and glorified Allah. You have children that you can say and look at your child and say, this person, inshallah, will one day grow up to worship Allah. Allah will be worshipped more upon this earth. What a noble goal to have, subhanAllah. Whereas nowadays, many people, they have children so that when they're older, that they can be looked after by their children. You find this, especially in the Asian community. I mean, in the Asian community, why is it that they prefer to have sons than girls? Which is completely haram to have this attitude. Yeah. If it's just from the perspective of a dunyawi perspective, a worldly perspective, that I want to have a son so that when he's older, he can look after me financially and take care of me. We find the opposite in Islam, subhanAllah. The Prophet spoke more about having daughters. In a hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he said, if a person has 3 daughters, فَأَحْسَنَ تَأْدِيبَهُنْ, and he was good to them, he brought them up in a good way, he taught them in a good way, then there will be a protection for him from the hellfire. And the Sahaba said, Ya Rasulullah, what if he has 2 daughters? And he said, even if he has 2 daughters. Another narration says, Ya Rasul, what if he has only one daughter? Even if he has one daughter. And you won't find that with regards to boys. You won't find that with regards to boys. So, subhanAllah, look at how people look down upon Islam. They say the way they treat women. Allah has made women the means for people to enter into Jannah. If you're a father, your daughters are a way to enter into Jannah. If you're a son, then your mother is your key and your way to Jannah. And if you are good to your spouse, then again, that's your key to Jannah. It's your key and the entrance for you to Jannah, inshallah. Also, other virtues or other reasons why people would get married in Islam, just for us to understand, in a complete sense, this institution of marriage within Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created men and women with certain emotions, certain feelings. And these feelings need to be seen to. They need to be taken care of. So one of those feelings is that of love and affection. Meaning Allah has created man with the ability to love, but also with the need to be loved as well. So He's created us with the ability to love. And where is a proof in that? The Prophet ﷺ mentioned that Allah, He created 100 portions of mercy. He created 100 portions of mercy. Out of those 100 portions of mercy, He created He sent down one portion of mercy to creation. With that portion of mercy is shared amongst all of creation, not just amongst human beings, but amongst animals. So with that one portion of mercy, we are merciful to one another. A child is merciful, a mother is merciful to her child. Even animals amongst themselves are merciful to one another. وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً, and He placed between you love and mercy as well. Allah mentions that. So He created us with this ability to love, but also to need love as well. To have that yearning to be loved as well. And so it's through marriage that we can love someone in the complete sense and be loved at the same time in the complete sense as well. And that's through as we said, through the institution of marriage. And so therefore, by that, we are taking care of all of our emotions, all of our feelings, all of these intrinsic needs that we have within inside of ourselves, physically, spiritually, emotionally, they are taken care of in this institution of marriage. Imam al-Ghazali, and this is actually a quote I came across yesterday, I found it quite profounding. So Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he said, whoever marries a righteous woman in order to protect himself from the whispers of the devil, or to protect his religion, or to have righteous children that will supplicate for him, and also loves his wife because she is a means to obtain these lofty religious objectives, will be counted as those who love for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Look at this, subhanallah. And when we love one another, when a husband loves his wife, or a wife loves her husband, it's not restricted to the common understanding of what is love. It goes beyond that. You love your spouse because they are the means. Your spouse is the means by which you can achieve great things in your religion. By being good to them, by protecting your chastity, having children, etc. It's through your spouse that you are able to achieve these lofty ambitions and goals. Therefore, you love that person because they are a means for you to become closer to Allah. And that's why if you love your spouse, you are counted amongst those who love for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we can speak at length about the virtue of those who love for the sake of Allah, because that is a very, very high status in our religion. Now, as students, now I'm going to move on to the next part of the lecture. As students, we have to be practical. Speaking about marriage, it's fine speaking about it and dreaming about it and hoping for it, but let's be practical. As students in university, it's not really feasible for you to get married at this time. So what should you do as a result? The first thing is that you have to have in your mind, don't be in denial Okay, do not be in denial. It's a part of your fitrah, your natural disposition that Allah created you upon, to yearn to have that partner. Okay, and there are people out there, maybe in this hall today, I don't know, they might think, you know, I'm not that person. You know, I can get married later, there's no problem, I have the patience, etc. You know, subhanallah, it was said that Tawus, who was a tabi'i, Tawus radiallahu anhu, the generation after the companions, he came across a man who said, man, he didn't show much interest in marriage. So he said, you better get married, otherwise I'll tell you what Umar ibn Khattab used to say to people that never got married. What did Umar ibn Khattab say to people that never got married? He said, nothing prevents you from getting married except one of two things. Either you're fulfilling your desires in a haram way, or you have your lack of ability. Okay? And I'll let your imaginations figure out what that means. Okay? So subhanAllah, yani acknowledge within inside of yourselves that this is a need that you need to fulfill. It's a part of your fitrah. Don't be in a state of denial. Because when you're in a state of denial, okay, you're only really punishing yourself. You're only punishing yourself. Secondly, we should realize the harms that are associated with not adhering to these principles of gender relations within our religion. If you're not going to get married, you're not going to be filling these needs that you have in a halal way, you are susceptible and you will be exposed and you potentially fall into sin. Now the Prophet ﷺ, he said, كُتِبَ عَلَى ابْنِ آدَمْ نَصِيبُهُ مِنَ الزِّنَا فَهُوَ مُدْرِكٌ ذَلِكَ لَا مَحَالَ. Every son of Adam, for every son of Adam, a portion of zina has been written for him. A type of zina, he will fall into it. فَهُوَ مُدْرِكُ ذَلِكَ لَا مَحَالَ. He will fall into it. A type of zina, he will fall into it. لَا مَحَالَ. There is no doubt, there is no escape. How did he explain this? Rasulullah ﷺ said, الْعَيْنَانِ زِنَاهُمَا النَّظَرِ. The two eyes, they commit zina. And what is the zina of the two eyes? By looking at haram. By looking at haram. وَالْأُذُنَانِ زِنَاهُمَا الْإِسْتِمَاعِ. And the two ears commit zina as well. And what is their zina? Hearing. And hearing haram. وَالْلِسَانُ زِنَاهُ الْكَلَامِ. And the tongue as well, it's zina, it's that of haram speech. وَالْيَدْ زِنَاهُ الْبَطْشِ. And the hand also, it has a portion of zina as well. And likewise his foot, etc. وَالْقَلْبُ يَهْوِي. The qalb as well, it has certain desires as well. وَيَتَمَنَّى. And it has certain wishes. It has certain inclinations. وَيُصَدِّقُ ذَلِكَ الْفَرْجِ أَوْ يُكَذِّبُهُ. And what will actualize what is in his heart? His private parts. Meaning, of all of these types of zina, what will make it reach the final point of the actual part of zina is the private part itself. Or it will deny it all. Meaning, or it will protect. If you choose not to fulfill the actual crime of zina, then you have protected yourself from these forms of zina. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ, he said in a hadith as well, that النظر سهام مسموم من الشيطان. That the gaze and the glance is a poison arrow of shaitan. Is a poison arrow of shaitan. Okay, what people like to think of Cupid, this innocent man or this innocent little, childish feature who's, throwing arrows. That is the devil who's actually throwing arrows at you. It is shaitan. Okay, it is shaitan. And that's what Rasulullah said to Ali radiallahu an about the nazar. He said, beware of the glance. فَإِنَّ لَكَ الْأُولَى وَلَيْسَتْ لَكَ الثَّانِيَةِ. Meaning, the first glance is okay, no problem. Meaning, you can accidentally look at someone and you turn away. You lower your gaze. You lower your gaze. وَلَيْسَتْ لَكَ الثَّانِيَةِ. But you don't have the right to look again. To look at someone with lust and desire, etc. This is the first key you have to remember. And the first important point whilst at university is that of lowering the gaze. Lowering the gaze. And there's so many ayat and hadith we can speak about, but we're running out of time. But an important question that I want to ask, and something that many people ask, especially in this day and age, why is it that in Islam we have such strict regulations with regards to, gender relations? Why is it that, for example, men sit differently in a different area to women? Is it because men they can't control their desires? They are these sexual beasts and predators that they can't protect themselves from women? This is how many people view Muslims. That they think, oh, look, that's the essential reason why you separate yourself from women. Okay? And I've heard this so many times. And they say, well, look, as for us, we can control ourselves, so what's the harm? If I was to sit next to a woman, or if I was to shake her hand, or if I was to be alone with her in a room, or if I was to hug her in an innocent way, or if I was to, kiss her on the cheek, well, there's no harm in that. I don't get all excited if I was to do that. But we say, look, in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has laid down certain prohibitions. Certain things He prohibits because of the evil for what they are, and other things He prohibits because it leads on to other things. It leads on to other sins. That's why when Allah spoke about fornication and adultery in the Quran, He didn't say don't commit adultery. He didn't say don't commit fornication. He said la taqrabu zina. Don't even approach zina. Don't come close to it. Don't come close to it. Because it's the first step that usually lead on to zina. And the other day you probably saw in The Guardian, there was a report of a high rate of rape amongst university students. Has everyone seen that in The Guardian? Look for it, research on it. You'll find it. Nowadays there is an endemic of sexual harassment at work. Forget men sexually harassing women, women are now sexually harassing men. There are reports of this. Seriously, go on the internet and look for sexual harassment of women, meaning women sexually harassing men. That's also become a problem. You might think something to be innocent and very simple, but Allah knows best about you and how you work. And how you work and work for certain things. And that's why He closes the door to that. That's why Rasulullah ﷺ said there are no two people that stay together in seclusion except that shaitan is the third amongst them. You might see it as being something very innocent, but in reality it could lead to something great. Maybe not there in that room. Maybe the man might not jump on her straight away, but it could lead to something eventually. A relationship outside of marriage. Once the Rasulullah saw a Sahabi looking at a woman. Yani he was amazed by her beauty. He was staring at her. What did he do? He took his head and just moved it away. He said, I feared shaitan for him. Okay, I feared that shaitan would do something to him. So he moved his head away from looking at that woman. Okay? Likewise in a hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, for one of you to be pierced in your head with an iron, with a needle made of iron, is better than for him to touch someone who is not halal for him. Subhanallah. For you to be pierced in your head with an iron, with a needle made of iron, that is better than for you to touch someone who is not halal for you. And the hadith which mentions touch, it doesn't mention touch with desire and lust. That's why the scholars said, if this is the case with regards to just touching, then what about if someone was to touch another person with desire? Okay? So remember this point, that sometimes Sharia prohibits things as a means of protection. Okay? Also, take into consideration that Allah, when He legislates a ruling, that He does it taking into consideration all of creation as a whole. So you might have exceptions in life, where a person, for example, he doesn't feel that, oh, he'll commit zina. He doesn't feel as though he will fall into haram. But that defeats, that's not the point. The point is Allah has given a ruling, and even though you might feel that it's not, the wisdom might not necessarily apply to you, but you are still required to adhere to those rules and regulations. Imagine if we said to people, implement those aspects of the laws that you think that you need. What would happen? There would be so much corruption. You know, everyone will be doing haram. Some people will be saying, you know, it's halal for me. Some people saying it's haram for me. There'll be no, you know, systematic approach. There'll be no stability in the way we approach our religion. How long do I have left? 5. Okay. Now, this issue of gender relations in purely from a Shari'i perspective, from an Islamic perspective, and we can speak about this from a number of different perspectives. Unfortunately, people have really sort of aggrandized this matter and beginning to speak about, you know, really, you know, and sensationalizing this whole issue of gender relations and how we interact with one another in the media. I'm sure, you know, as students of this university, you've been exposed to some of that. Really, I believe it's unfortunate that people are making something, you know, a situation or a condition which really this society has accepted and has been, you know, people within the community and society have been practicing these particular restrictions and etiquettes with regards to gender relations, and no one has ever had a major problem with it. But due to this Islamophobic sort of attitude that people have nowadays, especially an attitude which many, you know, media outlets are using now, they're using it to really to attack Islam and the principles within our religion. Even though it's creating no harm to them, people are adhering to these rules and regulations out of their own will. Out of their own will. I mean, this issue of segregation, we always say, for example, even I don't like using the term segregation, but you know, we always say that it is something within that we find within society, outside of, you know, religious practices. So, for example, we have girls' schools and we have single-sex schools in our society, isn't it? Okay, imagine you know, some of the opposite gender would try and apply in those for those schools. Would they be accepted? No. Why isn't anyone kicking up a fuss about single-gender schools? Why is it that we, for example, in hospitals, we have segregation in hospitals? Well, people will say, well, it's obvious. I mean, I asked this, I was interviewed by a radio station, and I brought this issue up. And I said, look, in hospitals we have segregation. And the presenter said, come on, do you want me to be clear why we have it? I go, tell me. He goes, I don't want to look at the private parts of of opposite gender. I go, I don't want to look at the private parts of my own gender. You know, that's not the point. You know, the point is that here people realize that there are differences. That there are differences. And we need to, you know, there is that sensitivity, that fitrah within man. Even amongst children, subhanAllah, you'll find that. Children, you find they have a sense of shyness with the opposite gender. You'll find that. Who taught them that? It's not something that they were taught and brainwashed with. It's a part of their natural disposition. That's why when Adam alayhi salam and Hawa, they descended, then they descended without any clothes. And so they went around looking for, you know, something to cover their sawatan, their private parts with. Why? It was a part of their fitrah, natural disposition. So, brothers and sisters, I mean, there's a lot more I can say with regards to things that you need to adhere to whilst at university, but I think that the important thing is that you try to look at and study, you know, the principles of gender relations within Islam. Try to learn the etiquettes of modesty, of lowering the gaze, of avoiding, for example, seclusion of the opposite gender, touching the opposite gender, avoid, you know, unnecessary free mixing and socializing, such that it can lead to maybe, you know, zina and haram. Avoid all of this. Seek help in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help you lower your gaze and protect your chastity. This is really important. I wanted to give some advice with regards to marriage, but I think maybe this will probably be addressed in the Q&A session. So on that point, inshallah, I will conclude. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He grants us beneficial knowledge and that He gives us the ability to act upon what we have learned today. Wa jazakumullah khairan. But unfortunately what happens is, especially when you're very young and you really want to get married, what happens is you're quick to to try and dismiss your father as being the wali. So he's saying he's giving un-Islamic reasons. There was one case I remember when one sister said, I need to change my wali. I said, why? Because he's a kafir. I was like, whoa. Why is he a kafir? Because he doesn't pray. Okay, he doesn't pray. And there is an opinion amongst the fuqaha that if a person doesn't pray, he's not kafir. If a person doesn't pray, he's a kafir. So I said, okay, before you were looking to get married, what was your father? Was he a Muslim or kafir? Okay, and that's when, but you know, this